Good afternoon, everyone. Today's podcast will take a little different approach insofar as we're going to have displayed on the screen several articles of interest related to the topic of domestic violence and or gender-based violence. And we would be following along with those articles by way of our voice recording. So, as you would appreciate, domestic violence or gender based violence can take many forms, which can range from verbal, physical abuse, emotional abuse, child abuse, sexual assault. And the statistics have shown that 1 in 3 women have experienced domestic violence of some sort. Now, we have directed your interest today to a specific article that was recently featured in the newspapers of Trinidad and Tobago that most of us had the displeasure of reading, where a husband would have inflicted physical abuse on his wife, including dousing her in gasoline, simply because, according to him, she ain't cook. According to the summary of evidence in that particular case, the incident took place at the couple's home in the presence of their 3 minor children, where he assaulted her and was in possession of a weapon and or also was charged with resisting arrest and using an explosive or noxious substance with the intent of doing or causing grievous bodily harm. And the police in that specific case reported that they got a call in relation to domestic violence from neighbors. And when they got there, they found that he had been beating her with a cutlass while holding gasoline over her. And when they sought to intervene, he put up a struggle, indicating that he came home from work and she had not cooked, seeking to somewhat justify why he was inflicting or why the violence was justified. So across Trinidad, we saw that these types of incidents have been particularly commonplace, and we often hear the public outcry for there to be amendment to the legislation, and or to have the legislation upgraded to allow for greater action to take place. So not just merely bite, but more of not merely a bark, but a bite as well. And other voices we hear echoing, saying things like, well, why didn't she leave? Why did she stay in that domestic relationship? And we're not going to focus too much on that because there are a number of cognitive and emotional issues that surround that we won't be focusing on today's podcast. Now, we saw the court in this particular instance being quite responsive and taking a very serious position in relation to the incident, and that particular assailant was denied bail. Now, quite comparatively, in a very recent other article, we saw an ex-husband being charged with breaking into an ex-wife's home and assaulting her after reading text messages on her cell phone between her and another man. Now, just to be clear, that they are exes, ex-husband, ex-wife. So in this case, the assailant was granted bail but with conditions. One of the conditions being that he has to stay within 200 meters away from the victim, and he has to report to a specific police station once weekly. Now, I saw questions being asked, well, how was he able to peruse her cell phone? And according to the summary of evidence in that case, he entered her home with a key that she was not aware that he kept after the breakup. And then he took her keys and her cell phone and held her by her hair while she was trying to escape. He then proceeded to go through her cell phone and began interrogating her over a series of text messages that he saw her exchanging with another man. And then he continued to beat her until again neighbors called the police officers, who responded to the reports, and they arrived on the scene, and he was charged with not only breaking and entering, false imprisonment, and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. Now, admittedly, the Domestic Violence Act has supported the fight against domestic violence in Trinidad and Tobago, but you've seen the need for several provisions, which has recently been discussed and or amended to allow for greater protection of not only adult victims, but minor victims who are minors. So provisions to allow, some of these provisions, just to highlight a few, would have been provisions to allow for protection of persons in a dating relationship. This means that it's not simply someone who's married or who is in a common law domestic union living together. It could merely be that you are dating and that you're a victim of domestic violence within the confines of that relationship. There's also the provisions to recognize the long-term effects of domestic violence on children. children who have to see domestic violence between parents or who have been victims of violence in their homes whilst domestic violence is taking place. So recognizing that they can be victims of having witnessed it or exploitation, there are provisions now aimed at protecting children who have witnessed domestic violence, which is now seen as an offense, and to allow protection orders to cover children as well as the applicant. And I distinctly remember being in a matter once where the judge highlighted that, like, while you may argue that the mother had been the person who had been abused, the children, having mere sight of that abuse, were actually being abused as well, emotionally and in other ways. Furthermore, we see that it's now mandatory to report domestic violence when a child is involved. So children under the age of 16 can also apply for protection orders against or using a parent, a guardian, or the children's authority. And again, recognizing that we are now advancing to a stage of smartphones and social media, the legislation, to be in line with these amendments, these societal changes, recognizes that you can also have abuse by capturing and disseminating images of applicants or children by electronic means, and seeks to make amendments to cover those societal changes. In cases where homes are shared by the applicant and the respondent, the court now has the ability to compel the respondent to vacate the premises immediately, despite the property being jointly owned or solely owned by the applicant, or jointly owned by the applicant and the respondents. You've also seen where persons convicted of breaching a protection order under the Domestic Violence Act, there's now an increase in the penalty, which was previously a mere $10,000 to up to $500,000 and or 1 year imprisonment. So you see that the penalties are now being increased to reflect the seriousness of the nature of the charge. You also see a specific definition of domestic violence to recognize not only physical and sexual aspects of domestic violence, but also financial, emotional, psychological aspects of domestic violence. An expansion of the category of persons who are allowed to apply for protection orders, as we said earlier, under or for on behalf of any abused person under the Act. And amendments are also being made in respect of the expansion of conduct or behavior that the court may prohibit the respondent from engaging in, and widening the threshold to be met in obtaining a protection order. Now, one of the things I thought would be critical to highlight is the Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, Olivia Grange, stated, "The intent is to ensure that the legislation as well as the institutional framework necessary for the successful implementation of all aspects of the legislation could be dealt with." And that's one of the critical things that needs to accompany amendments, would be that the institutional framework supports the amendments. We also saw recently in another article, I think on the UNDP website, Domestic Violence Intervention Center, where you can have it being erected in different neighborhoods so that people could know if they need to report it, that there's a place very close by to where they are that the report of domestic violence can be made. And in the two incidents that we cited to you earlier, you saw where it was neighbors who reported the domestic violence, where the police responded to the call or the cries of neighbors to assist the victim. And again, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, these came out of a joint select committee of Parliament that was set up to review not only the sexual offences legislation, the Offences Against the Person Act, the Child Care and Protection Act, and the Domestic Violence Act, of course. So it was not just a singular review of the Domestic Violence Act, but understanding that these acts operate in tandem with other legislation, including child care and protection, because children are often victims or witnesses of domestic violence, offences against persons, as we saw in the case with the guy with the gasoline, that he would have been seeking to cause grievous bodily harm, and Sexual Offences Act. So meanwhile, our Minister Grange, has recommended that a separate joint select committee be established to carry out a comprehensive review of the entire Domestic Violence Act on its own, and again, much needed review to propose some other amendments to make sure again that the legislation is acting in the way that it's supposed to.